The first time my new neighbor caught me watching her, I was standing in my yard with a garden hose in my hand, watering the exact same patch of grass long enough for it to start looking personally overwhelmed. To be fair, I wasn't trying to act weird. I was just trying to understand her, which somehow sounded even worse in my head. My name is Jake Morrison. I'm 36, freshly divorced, and apparently capable of handling custody meetings, mortgage paperwork, deck repairs, and every other adult disaster life throws at you, yet still completely unprepared for a woman moving into the blue house next door. Her name was Claire Bennett. I discovered that from the mailbox before I ever heard her introduce herself. She moved in on a warm Saturday morning with one rental truck, two teenage nephews who carried boxes like they'd lost a legal bet, and a golden retriever who instantly decided my lawn belonged to him emotionally, spiritually, and probably legally. I'd been living on that street for nearly 6 years. Quiet neighborhood just outside Raleigh. Big trees, wide porches. The kind of place where people waved politely from a distance without ever intending to stop and talk. After the divorce, the quiet became the reason I stayed. My ex-wife kept the condo downtown. I kept the house because I convinced myself stability mattered. What I never admitted out loud was that the house had slowly turned into a hiding place. Work, dinner, laundry, yard work, sleep, repeat. It wasn't miserable, it just felt finished. Life had stopped introducing new chapters and settled into maintenance mode. Then Claire showed up wearing jeans with painty stains on his knees, accompanied by a boundaryless dog and a laugh that drifted across the driveway like it didn't care who heard it. She was probably around 34, maybe 35. Brown hair usually pinned up in a careless clip that looked accidental but somehow worked. Warm eyes. The kind of woman who seemed approachable until the exact second she decided otherwise. And then you suddenly realized she had an entire hidden personality waiting behind the smile. For the first week, our conversation stayed strictly neighbor level. Your dog is digging in my flower beds again. Oh no, I'm sorry. He's emotionally attached to chaos. I can see that. Then came, which night do we put recycling out? Tuesday. Real Tuesday or Neighborhood Tuesday, where everyone panic rolls bins out Monday before bed. Definitely Neighborhood Tuesday. And your porch light flickers sometimes, I know. At this point, I consider it a cry for help. That made her laugh. Later that evening, I caught myself thinking about that laugh while repairing my porch railing, which was embarrassing and not information I planned on sharing with another human being. The truth was Claire changed the entire atmosphere of the street, not because she was loud, because she felt genuinely alive in a way most adults forget how to be. She drank coffee on her front steps every morning around 7, while the dog stretched out beside her like a retired security guard. One afternoon, she painted her front door dark green and somehow managed to smear paint across her cheek without noticing. She carried old boxes of books inside while muttering at them like they were stubborn family members refusing to cooperate. And yes, I noticed her more often than I should have. But I kept it controlled. A quick glance while mowing, a casual wave from the driveway, short conversations while taking out the trash. Completely normal neighbor behavior from a man who absolutely had not started cutting his grass in straighter, more impressive lines after she moved in. The moment everything shifted happened on a Thursday night. It was brutally hot, the kind of summer heat that clings to the air even after sunset. I was outside watering the herb planters my sister had given me as a healthy emotional outlet, which honestly felt insulting because the basil seemed mentally healthier than I was. Claire was in her backyard attempting to hang string lights across her patio, attempting to be the important word. One side of the lights was tied around a wooden pergola beam. The other half had somehow tangled itself around her arm. Meanwhile, Murphy, the golden retriever, was proudly sitting on the extension cord like he'd defeated it in combat. I should have walked over and offered help immediately. Instead, I watched. Not for a terrible amount of time, but definitely long enough. She stretched upward, trying to hook the lights onto the beam, lost her grip, caught the cord again, muttered something under her breath, then suddenly turned and looked directly at me over the fence. I froze instantly, garden hose still running. Claire glanced down at the puddle collecting around my shoes, then slowly looked back up at me. One corner of her mouth lifted. If you wanted an excuse to stare, she called out, you could have just asked. The hose slipped in my hand and sprayed directly across my ankle. Fantastic. An absolutely commanding performance from me all around. I cleared my throat awkwardly. I was looking at the lights. Were you mostly? Her grin widened. Well, I admitted, not entirely. That, she said, is an impressively honest correction. I shut off the hose because clearly at least one person in this situation needed adult-level decision-making skills. Do you want help? Help with the lights? I asked. Or help with your staring issue? I looked at her. She held the look right back. Then she laughed, and somehow the entire backyard relaxed with her. With the lights, I said. The staring problem seems more long-term. Good to know. I walked through the side gate separating our yards because the fence was low enough for conversation, but high enough that climbing over it would have looked deeply concerning for everyone involved. Murphy greeted me as I just returned from a military deployment. Claire handed me the tangled string lights. He's completely useless, Murphy wagged harder. He seems proud of that. He has confidence unsupported by facts. Honestly, I said. Same. That earned me a quick glance from her. Not exactly amused, more interested. That was the first moment I noticed it. The way Claire could pivot from teasing to observant without warning. Like she heard the joke, but also heard the loneliness hiding underneath it. So I focused on the lights instead. Safer territory. We worked together for the next 20 minutes. I steadied the ladder while she hooked strands across the patio beam. I untangled cords while she repeatedly told Murphy to stop trying to consume zip ties like they were snacks. Above us, the sky slowly turned lavender over the rooftops. One by one, the bulbs flickered alive, warm golden light stretching across the patio. Claire stepped back beside me and tilted her head up toward them. Okay, she said. That's definitely better. It is. Then she looked over at me. Thank you. You're welcome. For a second, neither of us moved. The lights made her backyard feel softer than mine. Less organized, more lived in. An open paint can sat near the steps. A stack of books rested on the patio table. A dog toy was abandoned beneath one chair. Little pieces of evidence that someone was building a life instead of merely maintaining one. Claire glanced at me again. Can I ask you something? I almost smiled. That sentence alone feels threatening. You should probably be concerned. Go ahead. She leaned lightly against the patio table, arms folded, eyes fixed on mine. You always this careful, Jake? The question landed harder than it should have. Not because it was unfair, because it was accurate. I looked away first, toward the string lights glowing overhead. Depends on what I'm trying not to damage. Claire stayed quiet for a moment. When I finally looked back, her expression had changed slightly. Still playful, but softer now. Softer and somehow more dangerous. Well, she said quietly, just so you know, I'm not fragile. Before I could answer, Murphy barked and charged between us. Knocking over an empty flower pot like emotional sabotage was part of his professional skill set. Claire sighed dramatically. He disagrees, I laughed, a real laugh this time. Unexpected enough that it caught me off guard because I honestly couldn't remember the last time one had come out that naturally. Claire noticed. Of course she did. And when she looked at me again beneath those newly hung lights, I had the strange feeling my quiet little routine of a life had just developed a doorway I was either going to walk through or spend the rest of the summer pretending not to notice. Claire eventually offered me a beer because, according to her, you saved the lighting situation. And Murphy, she added, has no understanding of gratitude. Murphy wagged happily from beneath the patio table, entirely unconcerned by the accusation. I should have gone home then. That would have been the clean, responsible choice. Helpful neighbor completes the task. Friendly goodnight. Retreat safely back to my own side of the fence, where I could continue pretending Claire Bennett didn't affect my nervous system like a hormonal teenager. Instead, I said yes. So 10 minutes later, I was sitting beneath the string lights in a metal patio chair with a cold beer in my hand while Claire disappeared inside and returned carrying another bottle for herself and a bowl of pretzels. Neither of us ate much. At night, her yard felt different somehow, gentler. The dark green front door looked richer beneath the patio lights. The abandoned dog toy still sat under the chair. A half-unpacked box of books rested beside the back steps. The top book was a gardening guide, which made me feel marginally better about the state of my basil plants. Claire originally sat across from me. Then Murphy stretched himself across both our feet like some kind of furry labor agreement, and she shifted into the chair beside mine, not touching. Close enough to notice anyway. That, she said, glancing up at the lights, is dramatically better. I specialize in emotional transformations. You mostly specialized in zip ties and moral support. I'm a man of many talents. She smiled against the rim of her beer bottle. I'm beginning to suspect that. There it was again. That dangerous habit she had where jokes somehow sounded heavier than the joke itself. For a while, we simply listened to the neighborhood settling into the evening. A distant lawnmower. Kids laughing somewhere down the block. Crickets begin along the fence line. The kind of summer night that convinces people to stay outside long after they originally planned. Claire tucked one leg beneath herself and looked at me again. So, she said, are you always this careful, or did I just happen to meet you on an unusually supervised evening? I looked over at her. We're still discussing this. We never stopped discussing it. Fair enough. I took another sip of beer and thought about my answer. The easy response would have been another joke. Something light. Something charming enough to keep me likable and impossible to read. But Claire had already demonstrated she could hear the difference between humor and avoidance. So instead I said, "I'm more careful than I used to be." Her expression shifted slightly. Not pity, just attention. That sounds earned. It was. She nodded once. No pressure. No dramatic silence demanding emotional performance. Just enough space that it made me want to keep talking. "My divorce was finalized about 2 years ago," I said. "No screaming matches. No police involvement. Just a slow collapse built on disappointment and terrible communication." Claire winced softly. "That honestly sounds worse. It was very efficient. I hate efficient heartbreak. You seem opposed to heartbreak in general. I'm extremely progressive on the issue." That made me laugh again. She smiled, but her eyes stayed on me. "You have kids?" "No," she nodded slowly. That probably made leaving easier. It simplified the paperwork. That line hung quietly between us for a moment. Then she said softly, "Yeah, that sounds closer to the truth." I looked down at my beer bottle. "What about you?" Claire leaned back in her chair and rested her head against it briefly before answering. "Almost got married," she said. I looked over at her. Did the full embarrassing production phase, venue tours, seating charts, spreadsheet tabs, then one argument too many followed by one honest conversation way too late. I stayed quiet. Claire kept her eyes on the string lights overhead. "I left before the wedding," she said. Which sounds dramatic, but honestly, it was mostly delayed self-respect attached to a non-refundable deposit. That pulled a smile out of me anyway. She noticed the smile immediately. "What?" she asked. That, I said, was an extremely polished line for low-grade emotional devastation. I've had time to workshop it. There was something softer in her expression now than earlier in the evening. Not fragile, never fragile, something more complicated than that. She looked like a woman who had deliberately shattered one version of her future, and was now standing in the middle of the pieces, deciding what deserved rebuilding. "Is that why you moved here?" I asked. "Partly." She took another sip of beer. "My sister lives about 20 minutes away. I work most of the week remotely. And honestly, I wanted a neighborhood where people still sit outside, wave at strangers, and accidentally tell you detailed stories about their dog's digestive problems. That happens aggressively around here." Claire laughed quietly. "The woman across the street told me her beagle had anxiety before she told me her own name. That sounds exactly right." Her smile lingered for another second before the mood shifted slightly again. "Can I tell you something mildly rude?" Given the established tone of our relationship, I said, "I'd feel cheated if you didn't." That brought the smile back. After the engagement ended, she said, everyone became very careful around me. Gentle voices, long pauses. That expression people get when they're trying to decide whether a woman living alone is independent or tragic. I knew the look she meant. Hell, I'd probably have given it to her myself. Her voice stayed light, but only barely. "I hated it," she said. "I hated feeling like people were reacting to the emotional headline instead of the actual person standing in front of them." Something tightened quietly inside my chest. Maybe because I understood it. Maybe because I realized I'd been doing a quieter version of the same thing ever since she moved in. That carefulness she noticed in me, it wasn't just about the divorce. It was about wanting something and immediately trying to reduce myself around it, so I wouldn't have to risk wanting more. Claire tilted her beer bottle toward me slightly. "That's why I said I'm not made of glass." I nodded slowly. "I think I understand." "No," she said gently. "I don't think you do." Her eyes stayed on mine. I wasn't saying don't be kind. I was saying, stop acting like noticing me is some kind of crime. That hit directly because it named the exact thing I'd been doing. I looked at her. "You think that's what this is?" "I think," she said carefully, "you're extremely aware of me, and you keep trying to make that awareness seem polite." The sounds of the neighborhood seemed quieter somehow. Murphy snored across our feet like a tiny lawnmower. I exhaled slowly through my nose. "You make that sound like an accusation." "I mean it as permission to stop pretending." That was somehow worse. I looked away toward the string lights because they felt safer than her face. Then, before I could stop myself, I heard the truth leave my mouth. "The truth is, Claire, I've never been very good at wanting things halfway." She went completely still. When I looked back at her, her expression had changed again. No teasing now, no careful softness either, just openness. "That," she said quietly, "might be the first completely honest thing you've said to me." "It probably is." She absorbed that for a moment. Then she set her beer bottle onto the table and turned a little more toward me. She said softly, "Then let me return the favor." My pulse shifted instantly. Claire held my gaze. "When you stare at me from your yard, Jake," she said, "I don't mind. I forgot I was holding a beer." I had noticed that. I assumed you did. You announced it pretty aggressively. I believe in efficiency. That should ease the tension. It didn't. Because she was still looking at me like she'd decided halfway honesty was no longer interesting. Then she asked quietly, "Do you know what I've been trying to figure out?" I shook my head once. She leaned back just enough to stop the moment from moving too fast, but not enough to make it safe again. I've been trying to decide whether you stare because you think I'm attractive, she said, or because you're trying extremely hard not to. And just like that, my calm little summer became significantly more dangerous. I should have given her something charming, something easy. A joke light enough to float us both back towards safer territory. Instead, because Claire Bennett apparently turned my defense mechanisms into decorative objects, I answered honestly. Both. Her expression didn't change immediately. Both, she repeated. Yeah, you find me attractive. Yes, and you're trying very hard not to. Also, yes. One corner of her mouth lifted, but it wasn't the same teasing grin from earlier. This smile felt quieter, more careful, like she'd asked a risky question and gotten a real answer faster than expected. Why? She asked. That question was harder. Not because I didn't know the answer, because I did. I glanced down at Murphy asleep across our shoes. Because you're my neighbor, I said first. That's the practical reason. And the real one, I sighed softly. The real one is that practicality is usually just cowardice wearing respectable clothes. That made her laugh under her breath. You are surprisingly difficult to impress. No, she said softly. I'm difficult to distract. That was worse. Much worse, because she wasn't exactly flirting anymore. She was standing at the edge of something real and silently asking whether I intended to meet her there or continue filing my excuses alphabetically. I let out another breath. Because I'm divorced, I admitted. Because you're rebuilding your life. Because I'm tired of finding something good and immediately calculating how badly it could hurt. Claire looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded once, like that answer deserved respect. Okay, she said. Okay, good or okay, terrifying. Okay means I believe you. She leaned back slightly, but her eyes never left mine. It also means I'm rejecting your request for permanent emotional retirement. That finally broke the pressure enough for both of us to laugh. A real laugh. The kind that let the night breathe again. Then Murphy suddenly woke up, sneezed directly onto my shoe, and wandered off toward the bushes with the confidence of a dog convinced he'd contributed meaningfully. Claire watched him go. He has truly awful timing. I think he just saved both of us. Maybe, she said. Then she stood and gathered the empty beer bottles. Or maybe he just postponed the inevitable. The way she said it stayed with me long after I walked back home. I barely slept. The next morning, I stepped outside around 7, holding coffee, and found Claire already sitting on her front steps beside an open cardboard box, with Murphy's leash looped around one hand. She looked up when she saw me. This smile was softer than the one from the night before. Morning, careful man. Morning, woman who interrogates neighbors beneath mood lighting. She lifted her coffee slightly. Everyone needs hobbies. I'd only made it halfway down my driveway when a silver SUV pulled up in front of her house. Claire saw it and immediately went still. Completely still. It was the first time I'd seen all the warmth disappear from her face at once. A man stepped out, mid-30s maybe. Expensive casual clothes. The kind of polished look that somehow felt unnatural on a quiet neighborhood street. He shut the SUV door, glanced briefly toward my house, then looked back at Claire with a smile that didn't reach anything sincere. Claire. She stood slowly. Nathan. So that was him. The almost husband. I stopped beside my mailbox because, apparently, pretending to check mail at 7 in the morning was the peak of my remaining dignity. Nathan noticed me immediately. Of course he did. He gave me a quick once-over before returning his attention to Claire. I found the last box from storage. He opened the back of the SUV and lifted out a taped cardboard box. Claire didn't move toward him. You could mailed it. I wanted to see the house. It's still a house. That's a pretty long move for someone wanting a clean break. Her jaw tightened slightly. I disliked him instantly. Not because he had history with her. Because he still spoke like he believed he had ownership over the narrative. Claire stepped down one porch step. Leave the box there. Nathan laughed softly. You still doing that? Doing what? Pretending you don't care when you obviously care too much. That was the moment I started walking closer. Not dramatically. Not aggressively. Just enough. Claire glanced at me once. Tiny look. Not asking me to rescue her. Just checking whether I understood the difference. So I stopped near the edge of the driveway and stayed quiet. Nathan looked at me again. Neighbor? He asked. Jake? He nodded slightly. Right? Claire's voice turned cold instantly. Don't do that. Nathan blinked. Do what? Decide someone's importance before you know anything about them. That landed heavily. Even Nathan looked mildly surprised she'd said it out loud. He set the box near the steps. I wasn't trying to start a fight. No, Claire said evenly. You were trying to see how far I managed to get without you. The street suddenly felt silent. Even Murphy stopped sniffing the azaleas long enough to observe the tension. Nathan stared at her for a second. Then Claire picked up the box, balanced it against her hip, and said quietly, I got far enough. For a moment, I thought he might argue. Instead, he got back into the SUV and drove away, carrying noticeably less confidence than he'd arrived with. Claire watched until the vehicle disappeared around the corner. I stayed where I was. Eventually, she looked over at me. You can stop pretending that mailbox is deeply fascinating now. I glanced down at the empty mailbox. Strong structural presence. That earned a laugh from her, though it came out uneven around the edges. I walked closer. You okay? No. Honest, immediate. My chest tightened. Claire set the box down carefully on the porch and rubbed one hand across her face. But I think I'm going to be. That felt like the correct answer. Not optimistic, not dramatic. Just true. I nodded once. You want company or space? She looked at me for a long moment. Then she held out Murphy's leash toward me. Walk with me. So I did. We walked nearly 2 blocks without speaking. Murphy pulled ahead like he'd received tactical instructions from the government. Claire kept one arm folded tightly across herself while staring straight ahead. Finally, she spoke. That was the man I almost married. I had gathered, and you didn't jump in. You didn't ask me to. She glanced over at me. Thank you. I nodded quietly as we kept walking down the sidewalk. She kept walking beside me, Sinrad quietly. Nathan always stepped in, but not to support me. To control the moment. I looked over at her. She kept her eyes ahead. That's why last night mattered, she said. You were cautious, yeah, but you were also paying attention. Those aren't the same thing. That sentence stayed with me longer than any flirtation possibly could have. At the corner, Murphy stopped beside a mailbox and investigated it like federal secrets might be hidden inside. Claire finally turned toward me. Morning sunlight caught her face fully now, and for once there was no teasing smile, no shield, no quick joke waiting to soften the moment. Jake, she said quietly, I don't need someone to rescue me from my past, I know. But, she added, I'm also done pretending I don't like the way it feels when you stand beside me. Every intelligent response I'd prepared immediately vanished. Then she stepped closer, right there on the sidewalk, and softly said, So next time you want to stare at me, maybe don't do it from across the yard. I looked at her standing there with Murphy's leash loose between us and realized something deeply uncomfortable. For 2 years I'd convinced myself that carefulness was kindness. But sometimes carefulness is just fear dressed in better manners. Claire stood close enough now that the morning no longer felt like a casual walk. It felt like a decision happening in daylight. No string lights, no beer, no nighttime softness makes things easier. Just her, me, a dog pretending to inspect government property, and a sentence I could no longer laugh away safely. So next time you want to stare at me, she'd said, maybe don't do it from the yard. I took a slow breath, then said, okay. One eyebrow lifted slightly. Okay, that, she informed me, was not your strongest line. I'm trying not to overcomplicate this. Historically unusual behavior for you. I'm evolving. That earned exactly the smile I'd hoped for. Small, real, still carrying traces of whatever Nathan had stirred up, but real. Then I stepped closer, not recklessly, just enough that she understood I wasn't pretending I'd missed the invitation. I like looking at you, I admitted. Claire's face softened immediately. The sentence sounded embarrassingly simple out loud, but maybe simplicity was the point. Not a polished speech. Not some elaborate confession from a man who had spent years hiding behind a reasonable distance. Just truth. I like the way you make this street feel awake, I said. I like that you argue with boxes of books. I like that you painted your front door green because you said the house needed personality. I like that your dog has absolutely no boundaries and somehow more self-confidence than most men I know. Murphy wagged proudly like he accepted the compliment personally. Claire smiled. He'll treasure that. And I like you, I said. Not in a casual neighbor way. Not in a you're attractive and my life's been lonely way. I mean, I like the way you notice things. I like that you challenge me. I like that when you ask questions, you actually care about the answers. She studied me quietly for a long moment. You really don't do halfway, no. Good, she whispered. I'm exhausted by halfway. That was the first moment I seriously considered kissing her. Right there on the sidewalk. Morning sunlight. Dog leash. Sprinklers ticking 2 houses away. Then Mrs. Hanley stepped onto her porch and loudly announced, Murphy looks handsome today. Claire closed her eyes instantly. I laughed under my breath. Murphy barked proudly in agreement, Mrs. Hanley waved cheerfully, entirely unaware she had just interrupted the most emotionally important moment of my post-divorce existence, then disappeared back inside. Claire looked at me, visibly trying not to laugh. This neighborhood has absolutely no respect for dramatic pacing. Honestly, I said, that probably saved us from becoming way too cinematic near public landscaping. That would have devastated property values. We finished the walk, but something had changed permanently. Not officially, not loudly, but the distance between us was no longer neutral territory. When we returned to her house, Nathan's box still sat on the porch. Claire looked at it, then at me. I should probably deal with that. You want me to stay? She hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, she said softly. I do. Inside, her house still carried that half-settled feeling. Some corners are finished, others chaotic. Books stacked against the living room wall. Paint samples were taped beside the kitchen doorway. A framed print leaning against a chair like it had lost faith in being hung properly. Claire opened the box on the kitchen floor. I stayed near the counter, close enough to be supportive, not close enough to take ownership of the moment. Inside were leftovers from a future she almost chose. Wedding planning folders, an engagement photo in a frame, guest book samples, a small white envelope with her name written in Nathan's precise handwriting. Claire stared at the envelope for a long moment, then laughed once. Not bitterly, not happily, just tired. He kept all this. Why? Because Nathan likes evidence. He likes proof things existed exactly the way he remembers them. She picked up the framed photo. In it, she stood beside him, smiling. But even from across the kitchen, I could see it. She looked polished, controlled, like she'd memorized the performance of happiness well enough to pass inspection. Claire looked at the photo for another second before setting it face down. I used to think leaving meant I failed, she said quietly. I stayed silent. She looked back at the contents of the box. But honestly, staying would have been the failure. That felt important enough not to joke about. So I simply said, I think you're right. She looked up at me. No defense this time, no humor. Just trust, carefully offered. Then she opened the envelope and read whatever Nathan had written. Her expression shifted immediately. Not heartbreak. Annoyance. Oh, you have got to be kidding me. What? She handed me the note. It was short, polished, written with the exact tone of someone trying to sound wounded and superior simultaneously. I hope this new life gives you whatever you thought I couldn't. I looked at her. Wow. Right? That sentence definitely owns multiple linen blazers. Claire laughed so suddenly she had to cover her mouth, and somehow that changed everything. Not because the note was funny, because she was finally laughing at something that used to hold power over her. She folded the paper once and dropped it directly into the trash. Then looked at the rest of the box. I don't want this stuff here anymore. Then it doesn't stay. Together, we carried the entire box out to the garage. She didn't turn it into a dramatic ceremony. No speeches. No symbolic destruction. Just one cardboard box placed on a shelf labeled Donate, Shred, Never Again, which felt deeply perfectly Claire. When we walked back inside, the entire house somehow felt lighter. So did she. She leaned against the kitchen island and looked at me. Thank you. For what? For not making this bigger than it needed to be. I smiled slightly. I'm learning your preferred emotional support settings. Good. They're extremely specific. I had noticed. The air shifted again then, quietly. We had circled back to the same tension from the sidewalk, only now there was no Mrs. Hanley, no mailbox, no Murphy pretending to supervise us. He'd abandoned responsibility entirely and fallen asleep in a patch of sunlight near the back door. Claire looked at me, I looked back. Then she said softly, Jake, yeah? I don't want to be careful right now. My pulse kicked hard once. I stepped closer. You sure? She smiled faintly. That is the most Jake question possible. I can ask less responsibly if you'd prefer. No, she said, shaking her head gently. I like that you asked. Then she reached forward and touched 2 fingers lightly against the front of my shirt. Small gesture, massive consequence. I'm sure, she whispered, so I kissed her. Softly at first, carefully enough that both of us could still stop if we wanted to. Then Claire leaned into it, and the carefulness didn't disappear exactly. It became certain. When we finally pulled apart, she was smiling. Not smug, not nervous. Bright, brighter than I'd ever seen her. Well, she said quietly, that was significantly better than yard staring. I laughed, my forehead almost touching hers. Useful information. It was still slightly careful. I'm improving, I noticed. Then Murphy barked loudly from the back door, apparently furious about the attention imbalance. Claire glanced past me toward him. He's absolutely telling the neighborhood. Mrs. Hanley probably already knows. Definitely. We both laughed again. And honestly, that became the part I remembered most, not just the kiss, the ease afterward. Claire made coffee, even though it wasn't even 10 in the morning yet, and I stayed in her kitchen while Murphy sprawled between us like an overconfident witness. For a while, we didn't define anything. Surprisingly, that felt good. Claire showed me where she wanted to hang the framed print near the living room window. I held it up. She stepped back and tilted her head critically. Higher. I moved it. Too high. I lowered it. Now it looks insecure. I glanced back at her. The print? The entire wall. That feels like an unreasonable amount of pressure for one nail. She laughed, and I realized how easy it suddenly felt to make her laugh, now that I'd stopped pretending I didn't want to. By noon, the print was hanging properly. Nathan's box was in the garage, and Claire walked me to the side gate with a smile she kept unsuccessfully trying to hide. So, she said, leaning one hand against the fence, are we going to act weird now? Probably. Good. I'd hate for us to become emotionally efficient quickly. I smiled. Dinner. Her eyes warmed immediately. Are you asking correctly this time? I'm attempting personal growth. Yes, our first real date happened 2 nights later. No fences, no broken lights, no emotional support dog incidents. Just dinner at a tiny Mexican restaurant downtown where the tables were crowded together, and the salsa should probably have required legal paperwork. Claire wore a red sundress. I forgot the language briefly. When she opened the door, she noticed instantly. Of course she did. If you want to stare, she said, you can still ask permission. I shook my head. You're never going to let me recover from that, are you? Absolutely not. The date went better than well. It felt easy. The kind of evening where silence didn't feel uncomfortable and laughter didn't feel performative. She told me more about leaving Nathan. I told her more about the version of myself that disappeared after the divorce. The version that used to say yes to things before automatically searching for escape routes. Claire listened without trying to repair me. That mattered. After dinner, we walked beside the river, and when she reached for my hand first, I didn't overthink it. That mattered too. Over the following months, our neighborhood became impossible to fool. Mrs. Hanley noticed everything. My sister found Claire's coffee mug in my kitchen and announced, finally, the yard-staring phase has evolved. Murphy started spending so much time at my house that Claire accused him of emotional betrayal. But honestly, the best part was how ordinary happiness became. Grocery runs on Sundays, coffee on the porch, fixing her stubborn bedroom window. Claire is helping me repaint the guest room, and immediately banning my preferred color because apparently depressed oatmeal was not an acceptable design direction. We didn't rush things. That mattered. We were old enough to understand that chemistry can be loud and still not deserve trust, so we let trust grow loud too. 6 months later, Claire's house no longer looked like someone hiding there temporarily after escaping a previous life. It looked like hers. Green front door, patio lights glowing at night. Books are finally organized on shelves. Murphy's toys are everywhere except the basket purchased specifically for them. And my house changed too. Not dramatically, just honestly. An extra coffee mug beside the sink. Her sweater was hanging over a chair. Dog hair on the couch I publicly complained about and privately didn't mind at all. A year after that first night under the patio lights, I asked Claire to move in. Not because we needed proof. Because one evening I watched her walk from my kitchen back to her house to grab Murphy's leash, then return through my side gate like the fence between us had become purely symbolic. And I realized we were maintaining 2 separate houses, mostly out of habit. Claire looked at me for a long moment after I asked. Then she said, only if we keep the green door. Your green door? Our green door. That was my answer. Yes. We sold my house the following spring to a young couple who looked equally hopeful and terrified. I officially moved next door, which Mrs. Hanley described as the least surprising real estate development this street has ever witnessed. 2 years after Claire first caught me staring across the yard, I proposed beneath those same patio lights we'd hung together. Murphy attended wearing a bow tie and looking deeply betrayed by formal wear. Claire started crying before I finished the second sentence. Then she said yes. Then she added, for the record, I knew you wanted to kiss me that first night with the lights. I looked at her. Then why wait? She smiled softly. Because you needed to ask. We got married in the backyard, small wedding, warm night, imperfect in all the right ways, string lights overhead. Murphy is trying to eat a boutonniere, Mrs. Hanley is offering commentary from the front row without invitation. My sister was crying loudly while insisting it was just allergies. And the strangest thing was this, my quiet life didn't disappear, it opened. Claire didn't magically make me fearless overnight. She simply taught me the difference between care and fear. Sometimes, years later, I still catch her reading on the porch, or painting something in the yard with one bare foot tucked beneath her. She'll look up, catch me watching, and raise an eyebrow. If you want to stare, she'll say, just ask. And I always do. So tell me this. What would you do if your new neighbor caught you staring across the yard and called you out with a single sentence that made pretending impossible? And have you ever had someone walk into your carefully quiet life and make you realize caution had slowly become fear? Tell me your story in the comments.